A Holiday Unmasked by Edwina Longbottom. Chapter 1: Transatlantic Escape. The sunlit departure lounge at O'Hare International Airport buzzed with a cacophony of travelers. Families with crying toddlers, businessmen engrossed in phone calls, and groups of friends chatting animatedly filled the air with a familiar chaos. Yet amidst the bustling crowd, Ron Everett sat in tranquil solitude. His gaze fixed on the wide glass window, he watched planes lift off and touch down with a precision that mirrored his own meticulous nature. For Ron, this journey was more than a transatlantic flight. It was a passage into a new chapter of his life, one that he hoped would finally bring him peace. Ron adjusted the well-worn leather strap of his carry-on bag and sighed, the weight of his decision settling on him. After 35 years as one of Chicago's top detectives, he was retiring. The city had been both his home and battlefield, with its streets telling stories of crime, loss, and justice served. But those streets had taken their toll. Nightmares of crime scenes and sirens had become unwelcome companions. Devon, England, with its lush countryside and serene villages, seemed the perfect place to leave it all behind. As he boarded the plane, Ron carried with him only the essentials: a few favorite paperbacks, a leather-bound journal, and a camera to capture landscapes yet unseen. His retirement wasn't meant to be extravagant. He craved simplicity, the kind that could be found in quiet mornings and unhurried days. Yet, despite his determination to leave his old life behind, his mind remained restless, his instincts sharp. Years of investigation had trained him to see beyond the surface of things, and it was a habit he couldn't shake, even as he resolved to simply be a traveler this time. The flight was uneventful but long, giving Ron ample time to reflect. His thoughts wandered to his last day in Chicago, where his colleagues had thrown him a farewell party. There had been speeches, laughter, and bittersweet goodbyes, but it was the parting words of his partner, Joe Morales, that lingered. "You can retire from the job, Ron," Joe had said, clapping him on the shoulder, "but the job won't retire from you." At the time, Ron had laughed it off, but now, staring at the endless Atlantic below, he wondered if Joe had been right. Arriving in Devon several hours later, the transformation was immediate and palpable. The village of Greencombe was everything he had imagined and more. Rolling hills faded into the horizon, dotted with sheep grazing lazily. Stone cottages stood like relics from another time, their ivy-clad walls whispering stories of centuries past. The air smelled of earth and wildflowers, a sharp contrast to the concrete and exhaust fumes of Chicago. Ron's rented cottage stood at the edge of the village, a sturdy structure with weathered stone walls and a thatched roof. Inside, it was cozy and unassuming, with wooden beams running across the low ceilings and a fireplace that seemed eager to be lit. As he unpacked his belongings, he felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. The peace he had longed for was here, but it came with an unfamiliar emptiness. By dusk, the village center came alive with a quiet charm. The heart of Greencombe was the Wandering Goose, a historic pub that glowed warmly against the encroaching darkness. Drawn by its inviting light, Ron decided to explore. The pub was exactly as he'd hoped, a crackling fireplace, wooden beams polished by time, and a friendly hum of conversation. Locals sat at the bar and around tables, their laughter and stories blending into a comforting symphony. Ron ordered a pint of ale and settled into a leather chair by the window, content to observe. His attention was soon drawn to a woman who moved through the pub with an easy grace. She was middle-aged, her kind face crinkled with time and laughter. She approached him with an open smile, her curiosity evident. "New to the village?" she asked, her voice carrying the melodic lilt of a Devonshire accent. "Just arrived," Ron replied, raising his glass. "Beautiful place." The woman nodded, her smile widening. "It is. I'm Martha. We don't get many visitors this time of year. What brings you to Greencombe?" Ron hesitated, unsure how much to share, but there was no suspicion in her tone, only genuine interest. "Retired," he said finally, "looking for some peace and quiet." "Well, you've come to the right place," Martha said, pulling up a chair. "Though I have to warn you, it's not always as quiet as it seems." Intrigued, Ron raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Martha leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. "Greencombe has its share of mysteries, you know, like any old village." As the evening wore on, Martha recounted tales of Greencombe's history, each more fascinating than the last. but it was the mention of an unsolved case that truly captured Ron's attention. "There was a murder," Martha said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Over 2 decades ago, a young girl named Clara Wentworth. Her death haunts this village still." Ron felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected, a dormant instinct stirring to life. He had come to Greencombe to escape, but it seemed that the shadows of mystery had found him anyway. Chapter 2. The Whisper of the Past. The morning light streamed through the windows of Ron's cottage, painting the walls in hues of gold. He stretched and took a deep breath, savoring the crisp, damp air that carried the faint scent of wildflowers and earth. It was a morning unlike those in Chicago, where the air always seemed heavy with exhaust fumes and the echoes of sirens. Here it was quiet, tranquil, yet his thoughts were anything but. Clara Wentworth. The name lingered in his mind like a whisper he couldn't quite shake. Over 2 decades ago, Martha had said, and still, the village carried the weight of her unsolved murder. As Ron brewed his coffee, he found himself pacing, the detective within him stirring despite his best efforts to silence it. He had promised himself peace, but peace now seemed elusive. By mid-morning, Ron found his way back to the Wandering Goose, the scent of freshly baked bread and the hum of casual conversation welcoming him as he stepped inside. Martha was there, as he expected, her hands busy polishing glasses behind the bar. She spotted him immediately and waved him over. "Morning, Ron," she greeted with a smile. "Couldn't stay away, eh?" He chuckled and took a seat. "Your stories have a way of sticking with me, especially the one about Clara Wentworth." Martha's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet contemplation. She set the glass down and leaned on the counter, her gaze steady. "Ah, yes, Clara, a tragedy that never truly left this village." "What happened?" Ron asked, his voice low. "You said it was over 20 years ago?" Martha nodded, her expression softening with the weight of memory. Clara was only 19. Bright, full of life. She was the kind of person who could walk into a room and make everyone feel at ease. She had dreams of becoming an artist, you know. She loved to draw. Her sketches of Greencombe are still some of the most beautiful I've ever seen. Ron leaned in, his curiosity piqued. "And then?" Martha hesitated, as if deciding how much to share. "She disappeared one autumn evening. It was as if she vanished into thin air. The entire village searched for days, and then they found her, by the old well on the edge of the Winthrop estate." "The Winthrop estate?" Ron repeated, his brow furrowing. She nodded. "The Winthrops have been the wealthiest family in Greencombe for generations. They kept to themselves mostly, but there were always whispers. Clara's death, it cast a long shadow. The coroner ruled it suspicious, but there wasn't enough evidence to pin it on anyone." "Were there any suspects?" Ron pressed. Martha glanced around the pub, as if ensuring no one else was listening. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "There were rumors. Some said it was someone from the Winthrop family. Others spoke of a young man Clara had been seeing, a stranger, someone from outside the village, but nothing was ever proven." Ron leaned back, his mind racing. The pieces of the story didn't quite fit together, but he could feel the weight of the unspoken truths behind Martha's words. This wasn't just an old tragedy, it was a puzzle, one that had been left unsolved for far too long. "Do you think anyone in the village would know more?" he asked after a moment. "Someone who might remember what happened?" Martha studied him for a long moment before nodding. "There's Edgar Palmerton, a retired schoolteacher. He knew Clara well. And then there's the Historical Society. They keep records, old newspapers, photographs. It might not be much, but it's a start." Ron felt a familiar spark of determination, one he hadn't felt in years. "Would you mind introducing me?" Martha smiled, a glimmer of anticipation in her eyes. "I'd be happy to, but I warn you, Ron, this isn't Chicago. People here don't like their past dug up." "I'll tread carefully," Ron assured her, but inwardly he knew that careful wouldn't be enough. Something about Clara's story had awakened the detective in him, and there was no going back now. Later that afternoon, Martha led Ron through the winding streets of Greencombe to the village's Historical Society. The modest building was tucked between 2 stone cottages, its facade weathered but charming. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and wood polish. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with books, ledgers, and artifacts that told the story of Greencombe's past. This is where I spend most of my time, Martha said with a smile, gesturing to the shelves. I volunteer here a few days a week. It's like stepping into a time capsule. She guided Ron to a corner filled with old newspaper clippings and photographs. Among them, Ron spotted a faded photograph of a young woman with a radiant smile. That's her, Martha said softly. Clara Wentworth. Ron picked up the photograph, studying her face. She had an open, friendly expression, the kind that made you feel like you'd known her forever. Next to the photograph was a newspaper article from the time of her disappearance. The headline read, "Local girl found dead. No leads in shocking case." As Ron scanned the article, a sense of unease settled over him. The details were sparse, almost deliberately so. It was clear that whoever had written it hadn't been able or willing to dig too deeply. This village keeps its secrets well, Ron murmured. Martha nodded. Too well, if you ask me. As they continued to sift through the records, Ron found himself piecing together fragments of Clara's life. Her love for drawing, her friendships, her aspirations. She wasn't just a victim. She was a person, vibrant and full of potential, and someone had stolen that from her. As they left the historical society, the golden light of evening bathed the village in a serene glow. But for Ron, the tranquility was an illusion. Beneath the surface of Greencomb's idyllic charm lay a darkness that refused to be ignored. Chapter 3: Shadows of the Forgotten. The days in Greencomb had begun to blend together, a quiet rhythm of mornings at the cottage, afternoons exploring the village, and evenings at the Wandering Goose. But for Ron, the quietude he had sought in retirement was steadily giving way to the pull of an investigation he couldn't ignore. Clara Wentworth's story had become more than a passing curiosity. It was a puzzle demanding to be solved. With Martha's help, Ron had amassed a growing collection of diary entries, photographs, and old newspaper clippings. Each fragment painted a picture of Clara's life and the village's undercurrents during the time of her death. Yet the picture was incomplete, like a mosaic with pieces deliberately hidden. That morning, Martha joined Ron at the cottage. She arrived carrying a small box filled with old documents she'd borrowed from the Historical Society. I thought these might help, she said, setting the box down on the kitchen table. They're from around the time Clara disappeared. Letters, meeting minutes, that sort of thing. Thanks, Ron said, pouring her a cup of coffee. I appreciate you digging into this with me. Martha smiled. Clara's story deserves to be told, and I have a feeling you're the one who can finally piece it together. As they sifted through the contents of the box, Ron's instincts sharpened. One document caught his eye, a torn page from a diary. The handwriting was delicate, the ink slightly smudged with age. It read, I don't know who to trust anymore. They know I've seen it, but I can't let them scare me into silence. Ron's mind raced. Who do you think wrote this? Martha leaned over to look. It's not signed, but the handwriting matches other notes Clara wrote. It must have been hers. What did she see? Ron murmured, more to himself than to Martha. The cryptic note hinted at something significant, something that had put Clara in danger. But what? Later that afternoon, Ron decided to follow up on Martha's suggestion to speak with Edgar Palmerton, the retired schoolteacher. Edgar lived in a quaint stone cottage on the edge of the village, surrounded by a garden overgrown with wildflowers. He was in his late 70s, his white hair neatly combed, and his eyes sharp despite their clouded appearance. Clara Wentworth, Edgar said thoughtfully when Ron mentioned her name. Yes, I remember her well. She was one of my brightest students, curious, imaginative. She had a gift for art. Ron nodded. Martha mentioned she seemed troubled toward the end. Did you notice anything? Edgar's expression grew somber. She did seem distracted in her final weeks. I remember her staying after class one day. She asked me about the Winthrop estate, said she'd seen something strange there. What kind of strange? Ron pressed. She wouldn't say, Edgar replied, shaking his head. She only mentioned that it was something she wasn't supposed to see. I tried to press her, but she brushed it off. I thought perhaps she was just being fanciful, as teenagers sometimes are. But now. His voice trailed off, the weight of regret hanging in the air. Ron's thoughts turned to the Winthrop estate. The name had come up repeatedly in connection to Clara, each time cloaked in whispers and half-truths. Whatever she had seen there seemed to hold the key to understanding her death. Do you think she was in danger? Ron asked. Edgar sighed. Looking back, I believe she was. But at the time, none of us wanted to believe something so dark could happen in a place like Greencombe. The Winthrop estate loomed large in Ron's thoughts as he left Edgar's cottage. The manor stood on a sprawling tract of land at the edge of the village, its silhouette visible against the horizon. Martha had told him that the Winthrops kept to themselves, their affairs shrouded in secrecy. It was a legacy of wealth and power that had shaped Greencomb's history, and, perhaps, its darkest secrets. Ron decided to visit the estate, if only to get a sense of the place. As he approached the wrought iron gates, he couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The grounds were meticulously maintained, the manicured hedges and pristine gravel paths speaking to a wealth that was both old and enduring. Yet there was an emptiness about the place, as if its grandeur masked something rotten. The gates were locked, but Ron spotted a gardener trimming the hedges nearby. He called out, introducing himself as a visitor to the village. The gardener, a wiry man in his 60s, paused his work and walked over. "Winthrop Estate?" the man said, his accent thick and his tone wary. "Not much to see here, I'm afraid. The family's been gone for years." "Gone?" Ron asked, surprised. "They moved to London a decade ago," the gardener explained. "Only come back for the odd holiday. I just keep the place tidy." "Do you know anything about Clara Wentworth?" Ron pressed. "She was found near the estate." The gardener's expression darkened. I remember. Terrible thing, that. Don't know much about it myself, but there were always rumors. People said she'd gotten too close to something the Winthrops didn't want found." "Like what?" The man shrugged, glancing around as if to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Couldn't say. But if you're asking me, the Winthrops have their share of skeletons. Always did." Ron thanked the man and left, his mind buzzing with questions. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that Clara's death was tied to something bigger than anyone in the village wanted to admit. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ron found himself back at the Wandering Goose. Martha joined him at his usual table, her expression curious. "Well?" she asked. "What did you find out?" Ron took a sip of his ale before replying. "Clara saw something at the Winthrop estate, something that scared her, and I think someone made sure she wouldn't talk about it." Martha frowned. "Do you think the Winthrops were involved?" "I don't know yet," Ron admitted, "but I intend to find out." As the fire crackled in the hearth and the pub buzzed with conversation, Ron felt the weight of the case settling on his shoulders. Retirement had brought him to Greencombe, seeking peace, but now it seemed the village had other plans for him. Clara Wentworth's story was calling out to be told, and Ron was determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. Chapter 4. Unveiling the Winthrop Legacy. The Winthrop estate drew Ron like a magnet. Even as he tried to focus on other aspects of the investigation, his thoughts returned to the imposing manor on the hill. The name Winthrop had surfaced too often to ignore, each mention wrapped in whispers of old wealth, power, and secrets. If there were answers to Clara Wentworth's tragic story, Ron felt certain they lay behind those iron gates. That morning, armed with the torn diary page and a growing sense of purpose, Ron decided to dig deeper into the Winthrop family's history. His first stop was the local library, a modest but well-organized building nestled near the village green. Martha had arranged for the librarian, Mrs. Tinsley, to assist him. "Ah, the Winthrops," Mrs. Tinsley said, adjusting her glasses as she pulled out a thick volume from the archives. "A fascinating family. Their roots in Greencombe go back centuries. Landowners, philanthropists, and if you believe the rumors, rather skilled at keeping their secrets." She placed the book on the table with a thud, its faded cover bearing the title, The Legacy of Greencombe Estates. Ron flipped through the pages, scanning for mentions of the Winthrops. Their wealth had come from tin mining during the 19th century, and their influence had only grown over the years. Yet, alongside the accolades were whispers of scandals, a feud with a neighboring family, a mysterious disappearance in the 1920s, and allegations of illegal dealings that were quietly hushed up. "What about in Clara's time?" Ron asked. Mrs. Tinsley pursed her lips. By the 1990s, the family had become more reclusive. The patriarch, Henry Winthrop, was known for his temper. He had two sons, Christopher and Edmund, who rarely ventured into the village. They were polite enough, but kept to themselves. Ron paused on a photograph of the Winthrop estate from the 1930s. The grand manor stood in its full glory, but even in black and white, it exuded an eerie, almost foreboding presence. Were there any connections between Clara and the Winthrops? Mrs. Tinsley hesitated. Nothing confirmed, but there was talk that Clara might have been involved with one of the sons. Edmund, I believe. Of course, it was all speculation. Speculation or not, it was a lead. Ron thanked Mrs. Tinsley and left the library, his mind churning. If Clara had been involved with Edmund Winthrop, it could explain why she had been near the estate the night she disappeared, and why her death might have been more than an accident. That afternoon, Ron decided to visit the estate again. The gates were locked as before, but this time he came prepared. He walked the perimeter of the property, searching for an alternative way in. Eventually, he found a gap in the hedges where the fence had rusted through. It wasn't the most dignified entrance, but it worked. The estate grounds were vast and meticulously maintained, despite the family's absence. The air was still, the only sounds the crunch of gravel under Ron's shoes and the distant rustle of leaves. As he approached the manor, its grandeur seemed to loom larger, the stone facade weathered yet imposing. Ron circled the manor, taking in every detail. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn, but he noticed a faint shimmer of movement inside. Someone was here. He knocked on the front door, the sound echoing through the silent grounds. For a moment, there was no response. Then the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 40s. She was elegant but cold, her sharp features framed by dark hair pulled back into a tight bun. "May I help you?" she asked. Her tone clipped. "My name is Ron Everett," he said, offering his hand. "I'm staying in Greencombe for a while and looking into some local history. I was hoping to learn more about the Winthrop estate." The woman didn't take his hand. "I'm Eleanor Winthrop, the estate manager. The family is away, and we don't typically entertain visitors." Ron smiled politely. "I understand. I'm particularly interested in the history surrounding Clara Wentworth. I believe her death might be connected to the estate." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but her posture stiffened. Clara Wentworth's death was a tragedy, but the Winthrop family had nothing to do with it. "Even so," Ron said, holding her gaze, "I'd appreciate any information you could provide. Clara mentioned seeing something strange here before she died. It might help bring closure to her family and the village." For a moment, Eleanor seemed to waver. Then she stepped aside. "You may come in, but I don't have much time." The interior of the manor was as grand as Ron had imagined. High ceilings, ornate moldings, and a sweeping staircase that seemed to belong to another era. Eleanor led him to a sitting room, where she gestured for him to sit. She remained standing. "What exactly are you looking for?" she asked. "Clara wrote about seeing something she wasn't supposed to," Ron said. "It's possible it was here, on the estate. Do you have any idea what she might have been referring to?" Eleanor hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the window. There were rumors of a hidden room, an old smuggler's passage beneath the manor. It's been sealed off for decades. Clara might have stumbled upon it, though I can't imagine how. "Why was it sealed?" Ron asked. She shrugged. "It's just a story. The Winthrop family has no need for such things." Her dismissive tone didn't convince Ron, but he decided not to push further. "Would you mind if I looked around the grounds? I'm particularly interested in the well where Clara was found." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "The well is off limits. It's dangerous." "All the same," Ron said, standing, "I'd appreciate the chance to see it." Eleanor didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. She escorted him to the door and watched as he left, her eyes sharp and calculating. As Ron walked back toward the village, he couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor knew more than she was letting on, and that the Winthrop estate held secrets yet to be uncovered. That evening, Ron shared his findings with Martha and Amelia, Clara's niece, who had joined the investigation. Together, they pored over the details, piecing together what they could. "If there really is a hidden room," Amelia said, her voice tinged with excitement, "it could explain so much. Clara might have found something there, something worth killing for." Ron nodded, his mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. For now, one thing was clear. The Winthrop legacy wasn't just a story of wealth and power. It was a story of shadows, and Clara Wentworth had paid the ultimate price for stepping into them. Chapter 5: Alliances and Revelations. Ron Everett's investigation had begun to consume him. The more he uncovered about Clara Wentworth and the Winthrop family, the more the case seemed like a web of secrets stretching back decades. His initial curiosity had grown into a relentless drive, and now he had allies who shared his determination. Martha, the warm-hearted villager with a knack for uncovering hidden truths, and Amelia, Clara's niece, whose personal connection to the case gave her a quiet but fierce resolve. The three of them met at Ron's cottage the following morning. The dining table was covered with papers, photographs, and notes scrawled in Ron's meticulous handwriting. Amelia had brought along a faded leather-bound journal that had belonged to her grandmother, Clara's mother. "This might help," Amelia said, placing the journal on the table. "It's mostly personal thoughts, but there are a few entries about Aunt Clara. I thought you'd want to see them." Ron flipped through the pages, careful not to damage the fragile paper. The journal painted a picture of a close-knit family devastated by Clara's death. One entry, dated a few weeks before Clara's disappearance, caught his eye. "Clara's been spending so much time near the Winthrop estate lately. She says she's inspired by the scenery, but I worry she's keeping something from me. She seems distracted. I just hope she knows what she's doing." "She knew," Ron murmured, setting the journal down. "Clara's mother knew something was wrong, but she didn't press her." Amelia nodded, her expression somber. "My grandmother always blamed herself for not asking more questions. She thought if she'd been more involved, Clara might still be alive." Ron exchanged a glance with Martha, who reached out to place a reassuring hand on Amelia's shoulder. "We're going to find out what happened," Martha said firmly. "Clara deserves that." Their next stop was the local library, where they delved into archives that had lain undisturbed for decades. Among the yellowed pages and faded photographs, Ron found a series of articles about the Winthrop family from the 1990s. One, dated a month before Clara's disappearance, stood out. It described a charity gala held at the Winthrop estate, attended by both locals and prominent figures from neighboring towns. Clara was mentioned briefly in the article as having provided sketches for the event's promotional materials. "This could explain how she got involved with the Winthrops," Ron said, pointing to the article. "She must have been working with them in some capacity." "But why would that put her in danger?" Amelia asked, frowning. "That's the question," Ron replied. "And I think the answer lies in that hidden room Eleanor mentioned." Martha leaned forward, her eyes alight with determination. "If it's still sealed, we'll need a way to get in. And if it's not, well, we'll have to be careful. Someone went to great lengths to keep this secret." That evening, Ron, Martha, and Amelia returned to the Winthrop estate under the cover of darkness. Ron had hesitated to involve Amelia in such a risky venture, but her insistence and her personal stake in the case had convinced him. Armed with flashlights and a crowbar, they made their way to the back of the manor, where Ron had spotted a set of cellar doors earlier. The doors were old but sturdy, their rusted hinges groaning as Ron pried them open. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of mildew. They descended into the cellar, their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. "Stay close," Ron instructed, his voice low, "and keep an eye out for anything unusual." The cellar was cluttered with old furniture, crates, and cobweb-covered relics from a bygone era. But as they moved deeper into the space, they found a section of the wall that looked newer than the rest, a patch of bricks that didn't quite match the surrounding stone. "This must be it," Ron said, running his hand over the uneven surface. "The entrance to the hidden room." He set to work with the crowbar, chipping away at the mortar until the bricks began to loosen. One by one, he removed them, revealing a dark, narrow passage beyond. Martha held up her flashlight, illuminating the space. The passage led to a small chamber, its walls lined with shelves filled with old documents, ledgers, and artifacts. In the center of the room stood a wooden chest, its lid slightly ajar. Amelia stepped forward, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside were papers, letters, receipts, and what appeared to be a diary. Ron picked up the diary, flipping through its pages. It was written in elegant, flowing handwriting that matched Clara's sketches. "It's hers," Amelia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is Aunt Clara's." Ron scanned the pages, his eyes narrowing as he read. The entries detailed Clara's time at the Winthrop estate, her growing unease, and her discovery of the hidden room. She described finding records of illicit dealings, evidence of the Winthrops' involvement in smuggling and financial fraud. "They were using the estate to launder money," Ron said, his voice grim. "Clara must have confronted them about it." The final entry was chilling. "I'm scared. I've tried to tell someone, but they won't listen. I think they know I've found this. If something happens to me, it's because of what I've seen." Amelia covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Martha put an arm around her, pulling her close. "We have to take this to the authorities," Martha said. "This proves Clara was silenced." Ron nodded, but a nagging doubt lingered in his mind. The evidence was damning, but it also painted a target on their backs. Whoever had killed Clara wouldn't hesitate to protect the Winthrop legacy, no matter the cost. As they emerged from the cellar, the night seemed darker, the air heavier. Ron couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The investigation had taken a dangerous turn, and he knew the next steps would require both caution and courage. But one thing was clear. Clara's voice, silenced for so long, was finally being heard, and Ron Everett wasn't going to stop until her story was told. Chapter 6: Confrontation and Climax. The air inside Ron's cottage was thick with tension as he, Martha, and Amelia pored over the documents they had retrieved from the hidden room. The papers were damning, implicating the Winthrop family in decades of illicit activity. Smuggling, bribery, and even connections to organized crime, all laid bare in Clara's detailed notes. But it was the diary's final pages that haunted them most, her fear palpable in every word. "She knew," Amelia said, her voice trembling. "She knew they'd come after her." Ron nodded grimly. "And they did. These documents are more than enough to prove Clara was silenced, to protect the Winthrop secrets." Martha tapped her fingers on the table, her expression thoughtful. "We can't sit on this. If we wait too long, someone might try to stop us." "They already know we're close," Ron said, his tone firm. "Eleanor was too quick to dismiss my questions. She's watching us." Amelia frowned. "Then what do we do? The police?" Ron hesitated. The logical step was to turn the evidence over to the authorities, but his instincts warned him against it. The Winthrops' influence likely extended far beyond the village, and he couldn't risk the case being buried. "No," he said finally. "We need to confront Eleanor. She's the key to all of this. If we can get her to talk, we'll have everything we need to bring this case to light." The next morning, they returned to the Winthrop estate. The sky was overcast, a blanket of gray clouds casting an ominous shadow over the grounds. Ron led the way, his footsteps deliberate as they approached the manor's imposing front door. Eleanor answered after several knocks, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Everett, I wasn't expecting you back so soon." "We need to talk," Ron said, his voice steady. "It's about Clara Wentworth." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. She led them to the sitting room, where she stood by the window, her back to them. "I told you before, the Winthrop family had nothing to do with that girl's death." "Then why did Clara's diary say otherwise?" Ron countered, pulling the battered journal from his bag. He held it up for her to see. "She wrote about the hidden room, the smuggling records, the threats. She knew too much, and she was silenced for it." Eleanor's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. "That diary proves nothing." "It proves plenty," Amelia interjected, her voice shaking with emotion. "Clara was my aunt. She trusted you, trusted this family, and you betrayed her." Eleanor turned then, her expression cold and unyielding. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't we?" Martha said, stepping forward. "We found the hidden room, Eleanor. We have the documents, the evidence. It's over." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Then Eleanor laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You think you've uncovered some great conspiracy? The Winthrops built this village. Everything you see, everything you have, exists because of us. Clara, she didn't understand that. She thought she could take us down." "And so you killed her?" Ron asked, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Eleanor's expression faltered, a flicker of something, guilt, fear, crossing her face. "I didn't kill her," she said quietly, "but I didn't stop it either." The confession hung in the air, heavy and damning. Eleanor sank into a chair, her composure unraveling. Henry, the patriarch, he found out what Clara had seen. He was furious, said she was a threat to everything the family had built. I begged him to let it go, but he wouldn't listen. "Who did it?" Ron pressed, his voice hard. Eleanor's eyes met his, her defiance giving way to resignation. "It was Edmund. He confronted her near the well. I don't know exactly what happened, but she fell. He said it was an accident, but Henry made sure no one would ever find out. He buried the evidence, paid people off, and I let it happen." Amelia's gasp broke the silence, tears streaming down her face. "You let her die. You let my family suffer for decades." Eleanor's head bowed. "I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting the family, but now I see I was just protecting the lies." Ron recorded the confession, his phone discreetly capturing every word. "This ends now," he said, standing. "You're going to take responsibility, Eleanor. If you don't, I'll make sure this evidence sees the light of day." Eleanor didn't protest. The weight of years of silence seemed to have crushed whatever resistance she might have mustered. She simply nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. As they left the manor, the sky began to clear, rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. But for Ron, Martha, and Amelia, the storm was far from over. There were still legal battles to fight, still questions to answer. Yet for the first time in over 20 years, Clara's story had been told. That evening, as they sat in the Wandering Goose, the weight of the day finally began to lift. Ron raised his glass in a quiet toast. "To Clara," he said, "may she finally rest in peace." Martha and Amelia echoed the sentiment, their glasses clinking softly. The journey had been long and fraught with danger, but it had been worth it. For Clara and for the village that had carried her memory for so long. For Ron, the case was a reminder of why he had become a detective in the first place, to seek the truth, no matter the cost. And though retirement still beckoned, he knew that some part of him would always be drawn to the shadows, because in those shadows lay the stories that needed to be brought into the light. Epilogue. 2 weeks had passed since Eleanor Winthrop's confession, and the village of Greencombe was still grappling with the revelations. News of the case spread quickly, drawing attention not only from local authorities, but also from journalists eager to uncover the scandal surrounding one of Devon's most influential families. Eleanor had turned herself in the day after Ron's confrontation. Her statement implicated both Edmund and Henry Winthrop in Clara's death and the subsequent cover-up. Edmund, now living in London, was arrested shortly after. Henry, however, had died years earlier, taking many of the estate's darkest secrets with him to the grave. For the first time in decades, the truth about Clara Wentworth was out in the open. Her family, though devastated by the details, found solace in knowing what had happened to her. Amelia, in particular, felt a newfound sense of closure. She visited Ron at his cottage the morning after the arrests, carrying a sketchbook that had belonged to Clara. "These are hers," Amelia said, handing the sketchbook to Ron. "I thought you might like to have them. Without you, we never would have found the truth." Ron opened the book, flipping through pages of intricate drawings that captured the essence of Greencombe. Clara's talent was undeniable, her love for the village evident in every stroke. As he closed the book, Ron felt a lump in his throat, a mix of sorrow for the life that had been stolen and pride for having played a part in bringing her story to light. Life in Greencombe began to return to its quiet rhythms, but the village was forever changed. At the Wandering Goose, conversations often turned to Clara's case and the strength it had taken to unearth the truth. Martha, ever the heart of the village, found herself fielding questions and recounting the story to anyone who asked. Ron, however, was ready to move on. He had come to Greencombe seeking peace, and though his time there had been anything but peaceful, he now felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in years. Clara's case had reminded him of who he was, not just a retired detective, but a seeker of justice, someone who couldn't walk away from a mystery when it called to him. One afternoon, as he sat on the bench outside his cottage, Martha stopped by with a basket of fresh scones. "You're leaving soon, aren't you?" she asked, handing him the basket. Ron nodded. I think it's time. There's a whole world out there, and I still have a lot of it to see. Martha smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. Well, don't forget us here in Greencombe. You'll always have a place at the Wandering Goose. I won't forget, Ron promised. And I won't forget Clara either. As Martha walked away, Ron glanced down at the sketchbook in his lap. He flipped to the final page where Clara had drawn the old well near the Winthrop estate. The detail was remarkable, but it was the words written at the bottom that caught his eye. Truth, once uncovered, is a light that can never be extinguished. Ron closed the book and stood, taking one last look at the rolling hills and stone cottages of Greencombe. The village had given him more than he had expected, and more than he could ever repay. As he stepped inside to pack his bag, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him. His journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next. And somewhere, he hoped, Clara Wentworth was finally at peace.